Groen knoppie. Right. I've hit the button.
All right.
So 11 people. Cool.
We actually had 39 registrations. So we'll probably see people float in. I mean, it is only for South Africa, right? Load shedding and all of that. We now are on stage.
I'll probably float out at 10 and then come back in again because I got a meeting at 10.
Oh. So we've got load shedding 8 hours a day now, Johan.
Gosh.
Yeah, that's where we're at. Cape Town, not so much. Well, we've got 8 hours in Cape Town now. I had a 4-hour stint this morning, and I'm expecting another 2-hour batches. So people will float in and out based on load shedding predominantly. So welcome to Cloud Fridays 2023, and we haven't done one in such a long time. Primarily because everyone's, sort of moved on from what their lives should be and what their lives are, and we're all trying to find lighthouses, right? That's pretty much where we are. And we had to look at the purpose of Cloud Fridays and what we're trying to achieve with Cloud Fridays. So for those that are new, welcome to Cloud Fridays. This is a 3-hour deep dive session into a specific technology. It's different to the other user groups that usually run during the course of the month. We don't have a 1 or 90-minute session with 3 topics or 2 topics. This is really about a deep dive. So we might present on DevOps or Git at the Azure UG, but this is more about a deep dive. And the only person that does this better than everyone else, and we found out this the hard way because Nick, Matt, and I have tried to replicate the Johan many times, and we failed dismally, and we've actually asked him to come back to Cloud Fridays to bring his awesomeness, his intellectual prowess, and now with added Lighthouse, right? He's not doing a session on Lighthouse today. That's a future session. But thanks everyone for making time. We know that we seem to think that Friday mornings work for a lot of people. And today's session is really about Microsoft DevOps, because we know Azure DevOps is the product, but there's an entire DevOps concept and a methodology and everything. And then also how GitHub plugs into DevOps. And the only man we know that can really get your gears grinding in these topics is Johan Meiberg. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Johan. I'll be in and out. This will stay on, but I'll be dropping my camera and mic because I also have to do some work. But once again, thanks, Johan, for making time, or taking time out in your schedule to. Johan's a big community guy, and that's why he does this. And he was part. We used to run communities together when he still lived before he abdicated his crown in Harties. So I'm just going to hand over to Johan, and I hope everyone enjoys. If you have any comments, questions, please drop it in the chat. Between Nick, Matt, and I will monitor what comes through. Please don't badger Johan. He's very, very soft now that he lives in the UK. So we worry about it. But anyway, I'm going to stop talking and hand over to Johan.
Yeah, well, thanks for that introduction. I think it's a little bit sort of blown out of the water. Half the words you used, I'll have to go and look up after the fact, but it is what it is. Anyway, welcome, and thanks for the opportunity to do this. When I arrived here in the UK, I realized that my network is actually only sort of South Africa based, so it took me quite some time to get into community here. I managed to hook up with the Microsoft Reactor folks in London, so I'm doing quite a bit of work with them. But good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. Most of you are probably over in South Africa. My name is Johan Meiberg. I'm a Microsoft technical trainer with Microsoft here in the UK. I am not from here, if you can probably see from my accent. I'm from South Africa, and I live in a little place called Loughton, which is just outside of London, but it's still on the tube, so the prices of the properties are still hectic. But it's about a 30-minute sort of train ride into the city, and I'm enjoying it here because there's a place called Epping Forest where I can get my mountain bike dirty and those sort of things. It's not my first rodeo with Microsoft either. In a previous sort of role, I was a cloud solution architect, and as Alistair mentioned, I'm passionate about people and sharing knowledge, so it's a pleasure for me to be doing this You don't really have to thank me. I think my life will be quite empty if I don't do this sort of thing. But there's my Twitter handle. I'm periodically pushing out some content on there. I'm trying to do like a AZ900 introduction to Azure on Twitter. And then you can also hook up with me on LinkedIn. I've got a couple of Microsoft certifications, predominantly because my work requires this. But I'm, one of the things that I train is the Azure Devops Engineer certification course, right? So this is a 4-day course where we essentially spend 4 days focusing on our DevOps services. And even though initially when I started presenting this course about 2.5 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, the course was predominantly called Azure Devops, and now it's called Microsoft DevOps Services, right, and Technologies, which kind of implies that we're not just covering Azure DevOps, we're also covering GitHub now. And so just before I get into the content, Microsoft has 2 services that you can basically do almost everything with, right? And we are quite fortunate that we've got an open hack sort of initiative where we've got several open hacks that our customers can partake in that will give you, X amount of challenges and work through the challenges. The DevOps open hack is kind of unique because right at the beginning of the DevOps open hack, you choose which technology you want to use. Do you want to use Azure DevOps or do you want to use GitHub? So of course, Microsoft bought GitHub, about 4 years ago. And slowly but surely, we've started focusing more on GitHub as our DevOps platform, but we are not moving anything out of Azure DevOps at this point in time. So some customers are panicking, should we get rid of Azure DevOps? The answer is no, you should not worry about that. Microsoft ourselves has such a big investment in Azure DevOps that it's not going to be easy for us even to migrate over to GitHub, but that will probably eventually be the plan, is to move everything to GitHub. There are not a lot of things that you can do in Azure DevOps that you cannot do in GitHub. And that's what I'm going to try to outline in this session today, is to show you that, hey, you get certain capability inside of Azure DevOps, you get certain capability inside of GitHub, right? There's a massive overlap between the two, so you get to choose. And if you're choosing something like Azure DevOps, you typically also get some integration from Azure DevOps into GitHub, right? So you can, for example, pull your repo, trigger your build pipeline, for example, from GitHub, and run your pipeline inside of Azure DevOps. You cannot do some of those things from the GitHub side, but I'll outline those as we go. So at a very high level, I don't have like an index sort of slide in my deck here, but we're going to be contrasting these 2 services and looking how Azure DevOps does certain things and looking how GitHub does certain things. Now, I've got some slides, but it's predominantly going to be demos, maybe some whiteboarding, that sort of thing. All right, so let's just first take a bit of a step back here and understand what exactly we're talking about when we're talking about DevOps. So there's this guy called Donovan Brown. You can actually search for him. Donovan Brown has got a good couple of videos around DevOps. He's actually a partner account manager right now at Microsoft. But he came up with this definition: DevOps is the union of people, process, and products that enables the continuous delivery of value to end users. Now, there's not a lot of fat in that statement. You'll see that almost every word is important, and you can take almost every word of that sentence and you can go and drill that down to a specific set of services and technologies and concepts and ideas that kind of, talk to your software development process overall. So the one thing I think is important is products. Well, the 3 things that are important here. Where's my mouse? There we go. 3 things that are important is products. And you'll see in that diagram on the right-hand side, you'll see that there's lots of different products, right? And I'll talk a little bit more to that. But the point is, if you're implementing DevOps, there's nothing wrong with continuously looking for additional products that help you to tighten your security, that does additional scanning, you know, on your source code, for example, right? So what you want to do is over time, as your maturity in the DevOps space grows, you want to unpack more and more tools in your DevOps arsenal, really, right? And that will essentially give you more metrics, and that will start, you know, driving you and optimizing your process as time goes on. So there's products involved here. There's process, and the minute you're talking about process, you should know also that you know, process typically points to some sort of a maturity model, and there is a DevOps maturity model that you can sort of adhere to, and you'll see it starts at a level 0, where basically you're figuring out what source code is, and as you move up these stages, eventually you'll see you implement and automate infrastructure as code, etc., right? So you build out your processes and you continuously loop back and optimize these processes to make your process shorter, to make your process more secure, and to essentially shift things left. And what we mean by that is we're shifting things left, and that means closer to the developer, because the closer we can fix things and sort things out to the developer, the less it costs over time, right? So process, and we will talk a little bit about that. And then the last thing, and this is probably one of the most important things, is people, right? And as you might know, the minute you're talking about people, you know, you kind of have to take a step back and understand, but oh my word, you know, people don't like change. And this specifically in the DevOps space can be quite a challenge, right? If you're working with a bunch of software developers that are, you know, that have been doing things in a certain way for 15 years, and suddenly you come in and you say, well, we're going to now do it like this. We are going to not release every 6 months. We are going to release maybe 4 times a day. You know, get ready for quite an intense conversation around that, because the answer usually is, but it works, why change it, right? And I'll show you in a couple of minutes why you want to change it, right? Because you want to optimize costs, you want to make your development time shorter, etc. And then towards the end there, you know, continuous delivery of value to end users, right? And this really talks to the agile software development methodology, where you don't want to be spending weeks and months of your time churning out product that doesn't add value to your customer at the end of the day, right? So whereas in the past we used to follow more of a waterfall type approach, the tendency over the last 15 or so years is to follow shorter processes and to churn out software on a more regular basis that adds value to your customers. So that's a long definition for a very short sentence, really, but this encapsulates DevOps, you know, quite nicely as far as I'm concerned. Now, you'll notice on the right-hand side in this diagram, there's lots of tools. We're not going to be talking about even remotely all of these tools, right? But most of these tools are tools that you can look at and you can say, oh, well, you know, maybe if we bring in this sort of this tool here, maybe it'll give us some additional telemetry. And the minute you've got telemetry in your process, you can go draw over a period of time, you can go draw a graph out and you can see, oh, well, you know, the number of bugs we've introduced into the system has just doubled every couple of weeks as we worked on this feature, or has halved since we worked on this feature, or the number of bugs and the complexity of the code has come down over the last 6 months as we implemented this open source you know, component in our tooling. So the idea here is to build a process that is measurable and that over time you can assess and you can analyze and say, well, are we getting better? Are we getting worse? If we are getting worse, why are we getting worse? How can we fix that? And how could we make our process better, really? Okay, so, you know, I will probably loop back to this quite a bit, and we might talk about some of these things again. Now, why is this so important? Because, and I mean, these numbers are actually quite old already. I believe that Microsoft now has over 100,000 developers. But if you take these numbers, 78,000 developers, and you save each of those developers 1 second a day, it saves you enough money to be able to add 2.7 developers to your development team. If you save those developers 1 minute per day, you can add 163 developers to your team. If you save each developer 1 hour a day, you can essentially add 9,750 developers to your team. And this is what the DevOps process allows you to do, right? This is what DevOps, the value that DevOps brings to you is, as opposed to having your developers sit there staring at the screen, looking at, oh, the build is needing to complete, it's taking 2 hours, we've got nothing to do for 2 hours, so we can stand there waffling next to the coffee machine. You know, you automate things, and you take some of that time back, and that gives you some additional time for your developers to be working on things that are important, as opposed to, you know, loitering around the water cooler or whatever it is that developers do. Ping pong, I think, is a big thing in, you know, for certain areas. So another reason why this is quite important. I'm sorry about the beeping. It'll go away in a minute. My garbage truck is collecting garbage here.
It's not your inverter, Johan.
Yes, that's maybe what the sound sounds like on your side, right?
UPS.
But my power is on. I'm happy. It's actually quite funny when we arrived here. We ended up in a closed-off area for some reason, where there's a gate and stuff. And one morning when I just heard a knock on the door, and it was Amazon delivering something. And I was like, how did you get in? Oh, no, we've got codes for your gates. And I just thought, my word, you know, how on earth can they have codes for the gates? And even the garbage people here have codes for the gates, and they can come right in. Anyway, that's a little bit different from what I'm used to. So anyway, one of the other reasons why we needed to kind of change the way we are doing things is there's a big tendency to move away from monolith, massive big applications that you release every 6 months or every year. There's a move towards microservices, which is a much more granular sort of framework. Each of these services might be a service that I can deploy on its own, segregated and separated completely from another set of services, with interdependencies, but kind of more at a granular level, right? So the tooling that we are using to deploy these microservices tends to be different from the tooling that we are using to deploy and you know, release these monolith applications. Sorry, was there a question? All right. So there's, and I'll talk a little bit to these microservices a little bit later. Maybe not in a lot of detail, but we will get to that. I've at least got 1 or 2 demos around, you know, Azure Functions and how to kind of deploy Azure Functions from GitHub. And then, as I mentioned, deployment patterns are changing, right? So we are moving away from that classic sort of waterfall type approach where there's a big design up front, and eventually we deploy to dev, we deploy to test, we deploy to staging, we deploy to production. Now, this doesn't mean that these environments go away. You might still have these environments, but the process of doing these deployments are changing. We are having to deal with things like blue-green deployments, where we might have 2 environments, and we kind of you know, swap those environments at certain times, right? We might we also have things like canary releases, where we've identified or have some volunteers that said that they are willing to test the bleeding edge features of the product before we make it available, you know, to the wider public. And Microsoft does this quite well in the Azure portal, right? So we've got essentially what's known as a closed preview, and maybe I can quickly just draw this out. I hope you can see that. So we've typically got something like a closed preview, where we're essentially targeting 5 or 6 different customers that asked for the feature, and we are saying to them, there's no SLA here, but we want you to start help us test these capabilities. After there's a closed preview, there's essentially a public preview. Sorry about my writing. There might be a public preview, and with the public preview, there still isn't a SLA around the service, but we make the service available to the general public so that everyone can start using it. And then after that, we make things generally available. And when it's generally available, this is typically when we hook up something like a SLA to the service and say, this is now something that you can use in production, and we will guarantee certain aspects of that service. This is essentially almost like a progressive ring-based deployment scenario, right? Where we are saying that, hey, there's canary users, there's early adopters, and this is again just one of those types of patterns that you might have. We also got this thing called dark launching, and with dark launching, there is the concept of even things like feature toggles will allow this, where you've built in certain features into your application and you start making it available to your end users by progressively enabling these features in the production environment, right? And something like Azure App Services can do this quite well. I might actually be able to show this to you if you just give me a second. Let me just go for, I hope everyone can see my screen here. So we've got, there's something called the app configuration service. I've got one here called Always On. So the app configuration service has got this feature called Feature Manager, right? And you can see that there is a new feature. And essentially when I'm enabling this, it enables the feature in the product, right? And when I disable it, it disables the feature. Now you'll notice that when I actually crack this guy open, you'll notice that there's some additional options to say, well, I want to do this, for a percentage of the users. So I can say that we initially maybe want to target 20% of the users, and for those users, it's going to show the feature, right? And then over time, we bump it up to say, 50% of the users are going to start using the feature. We bump it up to say, 94% of the users. Or we can use a time window to say, we are going to do some analysis, and we are going to enable the feature on Friday between 11 and 12 o'clock. And that means in the production environment, the customers start seeing the feature, they start using the feature, and then after that, the feature is gone again, right? So there's various tools that will essentially allow you to talk to some of these patterns that I'm referring to here. We've also got something called A/B testing, where we typically have two production environments that we are essentially, giving to end users, and these and we're doing some analysis. A/B testing is more end user interface type testing mechanism, but again, it's just a different type of deployment patterns. Why am I talking about these deployment patterns? Because these are the types of deployments that our end users expect nowadays, and these are more effective ways of releasing software, right? So the tooling that we typically used back in the day, a CD or a DVD, right, is not going to cut the mustard for these sort of deployment patterns. I hope that makes sense. Are there questions about this before I get into? Is it all making sense here, ladies and gents, or am I,
Johan, I have a question. So,
please.
Blue-green deployments, and maybe I missed it, versus A/B testing, are they not similar type of things?
They are almost, but I can show you exactly how they aren't. So with blue-green, you will have a production environment, right? And you will have, let's call it, and that might be the blue option, and you will have another environment. And app services does this really well, because with app services, you can swap, the different deployment slots. So what we're essentially doing is we are publishing features into this other environment. Let's call this the green environment. And then what we are doing is we are swapping these around, right? So we might, when we are ready, swap the green environment into the blue environment, and suddenly my users start using that scenario. What we are doing with A/B testing is we've essentially got two environments. We've got the A environment and we've got the B environment. And we are saying that 50% of the users are going to use that one, 50% of the users are going to be using that one. And we also use deployment slots to do this, where we specify a percentage of routing to these environments. So my end users, half of them are going to be using that version of our feature. The other half is going to be using that version of the feature, and we can go and do some analysis after the fact. So with A/B testing, both of those versions are actually alive at the same time. With blue-green, you are only one of the versions of the application is available in production. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay. That clears things up for me. Yeah. Thanks.
All right. Cool. Please, ladies and gents, if there are more questions, keep them coming. Otherwise, it feels like a radio show, which I'm trying to avoid. All right, so yeah, I do hope that makes sense. And I mean, don't worry about these deployment patterns now. The reason why I've got this on here is just to show you that hey, the way we want to deploy software nowadays is different from 1995 when we walked around with this plastic disc full of software. All right, so let me continue here. So let's take a scenario here, right? You build a killer hamburger recipe, and you think it can be better, right? So as your hamburger joint is busy growing, your customers expect you to develop better hamburgers, make better recipes, and to deliver those hamburgers to them, effectively. So if you think about that process, we've got essentially a couple of sort of actors in the scenario here. We've got the people that develop the hamburger recipes, right? These are essentially your developer folk. And their only task is to create new recipes and to improve existing recipes. Then we've got the builders of the hamburgers. They take these recipes and they actually construct the hamburgers. Then we've got some taste testers, right? Where I kind of want to live really is just to taste every hamburger. And these folks essentially make sure that the hamburger tastes the way we planned it for it to taste, right? Before we get our delivery drivers to essentially deliver those hamburgers, to our customers, right? If you take these concepts and you put it into a DevOps scenario, right? Your recipe developers are essentially your software developers, right? Or the inner loop, as we try to refer to them. These are the folks that write the code, fix the bugs in the code, do some building, do some testing locally, and then once they are ready, they essentially hand over their recipe or their source code over to the burger builders, and the burger builders is essentially your continuous integration pipeline that essentially builds the hamburger, right? And out of that, there usually comes some sort of an artifact, and that artifact is some sort of a thing that you're testing, and scanning components can actually test to see, does it meet the criteria, right? Does it exceed or does it stay under these sort of thresholds? And then last but not least, you got your continuous delivery side of things, where we're continuously, as we develop additional burgers or develop additional features, how we take those features and deliver and publish and release those features into our production environment so our end users can get the value out of that. So I actually thought this was quite a nice analogy. I got a slide internally at Microsoft somewhere. This is not my idea. All right, so I mentioned already that we're going to be looking at two different services that does all of this, right? So we were going to spend some time around the different repositories. We are going to spend some time even around the project management, but I'm not going to have too many slides more around this. I'm probably going to do a little bit more demo and probably some more whiteboarding, right? So around these four different four concepts. I can tell you now, I'm not going to be spending too much time around, around testing, right? I'll show some demos in GitHub around that, but I'm not going to spend too much time, talking about, I'm not going to cover Azure DevOps testing at all. So just be aware of that. So we will look at some of these concepts and look at how it's different between Azure DevOps and how it's different in GitHub for that matter. All right, let's kick off with Azure DevOps. Now, Azure DevOps is essentially a big tool, right? It can be quite daunting at the beginning. Predominantly, if you're new to DevOps, almost everything can seem daunting. But it's like any piece of software, right? If you just say to yourself, "How would I have done that?" There's a good chance that you can figure some of these things out, without too much trouble. So Azure DevOps, has got a structure to that. I've got some slides on the structure, which I'll get to in a second. But essentially, there are 4 components inside of Azure DevOps that you need to be mindful of and aware of, right? We've got Azure Boards, that's essentially used for project and task management. Right. Some of the project types that you can create in there is basic, agile, Scrum, and CMMI. Right. So these are the types of projects that you can create. And the Azure board scenario is essentially Kanban boards that you can essentially use to move your different tasks through your cycle. Right. So this is something I have to work on. I'm going to drag it from to do into working on it. And I'll show you how you can even customize some of those things. So I thought what I'm going to do here is I'm essentially going to be talking through these points, and I'll demo these points as I talk about them. And that's how I'm going to approach this. And then after this, we will talk about GitHub, right? And how GitHub gives you a very similar type capability. Okay, so this is going to be the plan for the rest of the day. I'll take a break probably halfway through, and we will work through all these options. Now, before I continue along that vein, I want you to notice that there's a structure involved here, right? And I've been working in the software field for quite a long time now. I don't want to give away my age here, but for a very long time. And the one thing that I've noticed about software is software has got structure, right? Almost any piece of software that you work with today has got some sort of a structure. If you think about something like Excel, right? You got an Excel workbook. Inside the Excel workbook, you got a sheet, and there's multiple sheets. Inside that sheet, there's rows and columns. That's a structure. It's a taxonomy, right? If you think of something like SharePoint, there's web apps. Then you got site collections. Inside the site collections, you got sites. Inside the sites, you got lists and libraries, right? In there, blah, 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 right? So most of the time when you're working with software, there's some sort of a structure. Azure also has a structure. There's management groups at the top. Then there's essentially your subscriptions. Inside those subscriptions, you have your resource groups, and then your resources kind of hang off the bottom of that. Very similar to that, there's also a type of structure that we've got in these tools, right? In Azure DevOps and in GitHub. The GitHub structure is not as hierarchical as the DevOps structure, right? The Azure DevOps structure. The Azure DevOps structure is quite hierarchical. You will see that we've essentially got an organization, and in your company, you can have multiple organizations, right? So one of the questions you might have is, why would I want multiple organizations? Well, maybe from a security and access segregation perspective, you might want to have 2 organizations, right? And you maybe want to separate the applications and the individual solutions and services like that. But in Azure DevOps, one of the key aspects of the organization is costing, right? Because in Azure DevOps, my organization is costed back to a subscription. So I essentially link up my organization with an Azure subscription, and that Azure subscription is then where the costing for that DevOps organization goes to. Let me show this to you for a second. So if I go to, there's my DevOps organization. This is Azure DevOps, by the way. You'll see I've got several projects in there. There's some organizational settings, and I can create a new organization if I wanted to. And you'll see that if I click on billing, then you will see that I've essentially, it'll take a second to load. I'm sure it will show that it has been set up. Maybe it doesn't. Oh, this is strange. Well, it's just going to make my demo more comprehensive, right? So there you can see there's an option to set up billing. This is linking out to my Azure subscriptions. And this means that all the cost, hang on, why is it not showing? Let me just hit the refresh button here. Okay. Inevitably, this has changed. I'm not sure how it changed, but there you can see I can go and say that out of these 3 subscriptions that I've got in my tenant, I'm going to set up billing. So any cost that comes out of this Azure DevOps organization is going to get costed and will go against that Azure subscription. And that means that if I create something like parallel jobs for my CI/CD, etc., that costing will roll back to that Azure subscription. This is probably one of the only reasons why we call it Azure DevOps, right? So there's tight integration from a costing perspective with Azure DevOps and Azure subscription, right? Further to this, you will see that there is my different projects, but I've got lots of projects. So in this instance, my organization is called JM400, and inside the JM400 organization, I've got agile planning and portfolio management. I've got a project for DevSecOps. I've got a packages section here. I've got a Kubernetes. I've got AZ slots. I've got lots of projects that hang off that organization. Now, again, you might be asking me, well, when will I create different organizations? Well, maybe you want to segregate your costing based on individual business units. So you've got 5 or 6 organizations in your company, or departments rather in your company, that each do their own software development and each have their own subscriptions in Azure for deploying those services, right? I can then go and create different organizations, and I can link them up to those department subscriptions and link that costing back to that. Maybe you want to do that. Maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you just want one organization, send the cost to a single subscription inside of Azure, and then create a project for each of the business units, right? And that's also an option. So you can scale your Azure DevOps scenario as you see fit. You can either create multiple organizations, which is probably a bit of an overkill if you're a small development company, but you can do that. But under your organization, you can have multiple projects. Under these projects, you can even have multiple repositories. So even the projects themselves scale quite well, right? And you don't necessarily have to say that, oh, we've got 5 applications that we want to build. We don't necessarily have to create a project for each of those, solutions that we want to be building. That's you can, in fact, even internal at Microsoft, we are using a project, and the project has got multiple services that sit inside of that project. And when we do our DevOps Open Hack, this is one of the first things that we teach and that we kind of coach the hackers into doing, is like, no, don't create multiple repositories. Use a single repository and assign code owners in that repository. I'll get back to that a bit later on. All right, so there you can see there's my DevOps organization, JM400, and inside of that, I've got multiple projects. If I create a new organization, you'll see it's gonna prompt me here for a new one, and let's say that this is, let's just call it My Fridays, UK South, happy days. I'm gonna say QNYJ3RMK, and it'll essentially create a new organization, and you'll see this new organization is essentially going to be empty. There won't be any projects inside of that. It's prompting me to create a new project, right? But I don't have to do this, right? So if I go back to here and I go back to My Fridays, you'll see that currently there aren't any projects inside of that, right? And if I wanted to create a project, I can say that this is my Friday project. Oh, that will drive me crazy. My Friday project, give it a proper description, right? And you can see there that I can specify the visibility, either, public facing, either private. Under certain conditions, you can even specify that it's organization wide, and I can link it up to my Azure AD if I wanted to, right? And then if I scroll down, you'll see that I can choose either Git or Team Foundation version control. And the key difference there is essentially that Git is distributed source control and Team Foundation is centralized version control, and I can go and choose my process there, right? I'm going to get back to that in a few minutes. I just want to show you this structure first. So if I go to my organizational settings here, I've created a new organization now. There's the URL, blah, blah, blah. This URL is probably going to be important for certain things. And then you'll see that there's a list of projects. I don't have any projects in there right now. There's a bunch of users, right? And you can see that I can actually go and invite new users if I wanted to. And then there again is my billing option for this organization. And again, the billing for this organization should not be set up. If I click on set up billing, then I can actually go and assign the billing for this organization to one of my Azure subscriptions. I hit the save button, and any costs that I incur now in this organization will get charged back to that Azure subscription. There's a couple of additional things here. You'll see that we've got some notification options, right, where I can specify what the conditions specifically are when I want to receive notifications. So this is something that I would actually plan quite carefully. What you don't want is you don't want your team to get spam, right? I've seen so many times that people misuse something like this, and they end up sending so many messages to the team members. Some of the team members cannot even fix the problem if there's a problem, but they get the message, and then they end up building rules into their Outlook environment to say, well, just move all this stuff to some folder. I will go through this once every 2 years. And you want to avoid that. So make sure that you target, these notifications quite well, and subscribe to the notifications when you need to see them. It's not something that you want to just send out willy-nilly. And then if I scroll down a little bit, I'm not going to go through everything here, but you'll notice that there's something called process, right? And you'll see in process, we've got basic process, agile, scrum, and CMMI. Now, I'm going to hit the help button here, and you'll see that we've essentially got, let me just, going to do a quick search here for I'm looking for a specific URL here. There we go. You will see that essentially the type of project that you choose, and I'll put this in the chat window so you can actually go and check this out. Declarative burger recipes, I like that. So you'll see that if I, for example, choose the agile process, then I've got epic and feature, and under that I've got essentially user stories and tasks. If I choose the Scrum process, you will see it looks very similar, except I've got an epic and a feature, and I've got a product backlog, and I've got an impediment as opposed to an issue, right? Basic process, a very, very basic process. And then on the CMMI side, you'll see that we've essentially got requirements. And then under issue, change, and risk management, we've got change request issues. So we've got these different types of project templates, and I can even tweak these templates, right? So if I go back in here, I can, for example, say, hey, I like Scrum, and I can actually go and create an inherited process from this. So let's call it my Scrum. And you can see that if I crack open my Scrum, I can, for example, say that, hey, I want to make changes to an epic, right? And in here, you'll notice that I can essentially create a new group. I'm going to call it costing. And I'm going to, in costing, create a new field. And in there, I'm going to say cost center. This is going to be a single line of text. You'll notice that I can specify from a list if I wanted to, do a couple of things there, give it a proper description. And then from the options perspective, I can say that this has to be a required field. I can also, from a layout perspective, say that it's going to be added to the costing group, and I'll hit the add field button there, right? And I can now go and add some additional fields, right? You can see that. So I can actually take granular control over what these things look like when someone creates a new task or creates a new epic. I can go and customize those fields to my to whatever degree I wanted to. So there's also some pipeline settings and things here which will essentially inherit into the project, and from there inherit into the pipeline, but I'm not going to talk too much about that now. Let's actually go and create a project. So I'm going to say that this is, I'm just going to refresh this. And I'm going to say that this is my Friday project, proper description as usual. And then under advanced, I'm going to choose Git for the version control. And you can see that there's the My Scrum process tracking mechanism. There's my Friday. And if I go for boards here, you will see if I create a new epic, then you will see there's that costing section that I just customized in that process. So you can take these 4 processes and you can customize the input forms and the task tracking forms that you're going to be adding these things into, and you can capture all the information that's relevant to your process if you wanted to do that. If that makes sense. In this instance, I used the customized version of the Scrum process, and you can see it's prompting me there for a cost center, and it's a required field. So if I don't have a cost center, it's not going to allow me to essentially save this this item. There you can see I can say make a burger. Oopsie. And I can, assign it to myself, for example, assign it to someone. There's a proper description again, specify the acceptance criteria. I can actually, you'll see on the right-hand side here, I can actually go and link it to a related item, right? So I can say add there's already an item, I want to link it to that item, and this is essentially how I'll create that structure that I showed you here a minute ago, right? This structure here. So if I use the Scrum process, I've just added a new epic. I can link that to a feature, and I can link a product backlog item to the feature, and I can go and link an individual task to the product backlog item. So that linked item is essentially how you will create part of that structure that I just showed to you now. All right, so and then there's a couple of additional things that you might see in here. You'll see if I click on boards, this is essentially those Kanban boards that I spoke about, right? Which if I'm just going to go add a new product backlog item, make the report. There's some typos in there, but this is what we mean by with boards and Kanban boards, and you'll see that I can essentially take this and move it from new, drag it to approved, drag it to committed, drag it through to done eventually when it's done, right? So this is essentially how you will manage your work items and those individual tasks related to your project. I've also got some customization available for these boards, right? So if I click here on configure some of these settings, then you will notice that I can essentially specify some styles and style rules, right? So you can see there that I can say the card color is going to be red if the rule is, if it's a bug, right? And you will see that then I can specify if the work item type, for example, is type bug, then it has to show them as red, and I can actually go and save that out. I'm actually going to make some more changes. I can also have tags and color code some of these scenarios, and you'll see that I can even make some changes to the columns, in my board scenario, right? So these columns that I showed you just now, these, new, approved, those columns that it defaulted to, I can go and rename some of these, right? And in fact, I can even go and add a column, and I can say, we are thinking about it. And this specific column, we can put just before approved, and I can hit the save and close, and you'll see that now suddenly there's another column there called thinking about it, right? And I typically want to first drag it in there, and that might have some consequence in your software development process when it's like, oh, in what phase is your feature? It's in the we're thinking about it phase, whatever that might mean to you. There's also some additional items. You'll see that we've got swim lanes in there. So I can actually go and add a swim lane. This is second language issues for me. I think it's how you spell that. Yeah, there we go. Expedite. And you'll see I can hit the save and close option. And now you'll see that there's an additional swim lane that we can say, well, the minute we are adding this type of bug, some bug, first of all, it comes up in the red that I tagged it on, and this is a bug, so we're going to expedite this, and I'm going to drag it into this area. So with Azure boards, we've essentially got a very granular sort of management and configuration capability around your process. Not just the process, but even the boards themselves, the different columns that you might want to be using, as well as some color coding, etc. There's some additional options in here as well. You will see that I can specify the working days, for example, on which days do we expect the team to be working. All of those things are available. And then you'll also see that if I click on sprints here, and then it'll essentially allow me to specify the different sprints. Currently, there's a couple of sprints in there. I can specify a new sprint, and I can even go to capacity, and I can go and say that Johan Meiberg is going to take X amount of days off during these times, and he's essentially in this project, he's essentially going to be doing development, and he's got something like 7 hours per day, and this will essentially feed into the project itself and start outlining when certain features are going to be ready. If I say there's a new bug introduced into the system, it's going to take roughly 7 hours to do that. Johan's already working on something, so that means the bug will only get fixed tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock, right? So you've got that sort of level of project management at this point as well. There's one more important thing here that I want to just quickly touch on, and it's queries, right? So I can actually go and create a new query, and you can see there that I can go and say, show me the items where the work item type is of type bug. And if I run the query, you can see that there's my bug. these queries are essentially not just used for you to view the information, but we can use these queries to even stop our process later on. So when I'd want to do a deployment, we can essentially let the pipeline wait for these queries to show that, oh, we're only going to release the project, the application to production if there are 0 bugs, if there are less than 5 bugs, if whatever that criteria is, right? So this actually feeds nicely into your process later on, where you can essentially use these queries and the number of items in these queries to decide what the threshold will be for your process to move forward. All right, so that's essentially Azure boards. Please, questions, comments. Am I going too fast? Am I going too slow?
I've got a question, Johan.
Go for it.
Well, it's not really a question, it's more of a statement. So boards, I suppose, is something that project managers would spend a lot of time in customizing and viewing and kind of managing. I suppose you'd have your daily stand-up and you can talk to your tasks and things, but I don't see developers or IT ops people spending a lot of time in boards.
Yeah, so I think you're mostly right. However, you might not actually have, it depends on your team and how your team is essentially divvied up, right? So you might find that in your environment, it's the project manager that assigns certain things, that specifies how much time people are going to be working on that. But in terms of what I need to work on as a developer, this is where I will come, right? I will go to work items and I will go and say, work items, what do I need to work on, right? And you'll see that it's got assigned to me in here. So you're 100% right. The management and the configuration of this might predominantly be from a ops perspective, from a project management perspective, but this is literally where your developers will also come in and see what work they need to do and assign that work to different people, right? It's like, oh, it's assigned to me. It should be assigned to Joe because Joe, focuses on the database tier, for example, right? So you're right, but it also depends on how your team actually operates.
Cool.
And in fact, I would actually add to that to say that in most cases, this is kind of in Azure DevOps going to be where your developers are going to congregate digitally, right? And as Sean is also mentioning, like close issues. Say, hey, I'm busy working on this issue. No, wait, this issue is linked to this issue. That's something that typically not your project manager might actually do, right? You don't want to have to go to the project manager to specify, oh, this is actually a database issue. This is something that you don't want that central point of failure or have to consult the project manager every time you go like, oh, this actually issue is related to that issue. So it largely depends, and also as Sean mentions there, it depends. So I'm glad that I can use that as an answer for almost anything. All right. So. And I mean, ladies and gents, I've touched the surface here. If you really want to get into this, ms az400 labs, you'll notice that there's an agile planning and portfolio management lab here. I'll put this link in the chat window for you as well. This is essentially the labs for our official courses, and you can actually go and work through this where they will show you how to create the project. You want to add some color, some color to your environment. Steps on how to do much more than what I did in my demo just now, right? So you can actually go and work through these labs at your own time. It's well worth spending that time on these labs. And as you can see there, this is essentially a GitHub repo, so you can go and fix fix issues in here if you're that way inclined. I actually get measured on that, believe it or not. Right, so that is essentially the structure that I mentioned, and that is Azure Boards. So I'm not going to go over to repos now. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to flip over to GitHub. And this is the approach I'm going to be taking. I'm sorry, this is the first time I do a session like this where I'm taking 4 days and cramming it into 3 hours. So GitHub has got a very similar capability. All right, so let's take a look at how GitHub does this. So if you're not familiar with GitHub, GitHub has this thing called projects. And I've got a couple of projects here, right? More importantly, though, I've got this repo called course content, right? It's a repository that I created for my different courses. So you'll see that there's one big PowerShell script in here, right? That I use in my developer course. But you'll see that there's also a GitHub folder, and I'm going to share this with you. I'll put this in the chat window as well, so you can actually go and fork this repo if you wanted to do that, or just go copy some of the content in there. But you'll see that I've got this folder there called GitHub, and this is something I got from an internal. This is something I got from an internal call some time ago. In fact, I think I've got this locally, so I don't have to sort of that. Give me just 1 second. Repos. Course content. Right, so there's this repo locally, and you'll see that what I did is I just ended up taking screenshots, right? So what they've done here, and please go and look at that information. It gives you a really good idea of essentially the relationships between all the different GitHub components and concepts, right? So if you're new to GitHub, this is a really good starting point. It'll show you, oh, look, you've got this thing called the repository, and the repository has got a one-to-many relationship between milestones. It's got a one-to-one relationship between templates, right? One-to-many with projects, one-to-many with GitHub actions, one-to-many with issues and pull requests, right? And then there's another image, pull requests. You got a one-to-many with milestones. And I've taken a screenshot of all of these things, and you can go and see exactly what the relationship is between that. On top of that, there's also, again, the organization and showing you some of the structure that we've got inside of GitHub. It's well worth checking this out if you are new to GitHub for that matter, and just get your head around some of these components and how these things relate to one another, because GitHub is a little bit different in terms of the structure. Now, I mentioned the organization in Azure DevOps. There's also a concept of an organization in GitHub, right? So you will see there that if I click on your organizations, that I'm actually a member of a whole bunch of different organizations, right? There you can see Azure, right? For this, multi-factor, multi-factor authentication is required. This is actually an organization that's owned by Microsoft that I have got some permissions on, right? There you can see the DevOps Open Hack. There's another Microsoft. This is the Microsoft, I think the Microsoft open source repository, all of our code in there. This is the MSI organization that's essentially, a list of all the repositories that we use in my department, right? There's Office Dev, for example. So some of these organizations are organizations that are related to my company and might require some additional, authentication for me to access some of those resources, right? And you'll see if I, and then of course I've got my own account, which is essentially Sahedi Mac, and you'll see under that I've essentially got lots of different repos, right? So again, on on GitHub, we also have the concept of an organization, but we don't have projects inside of that. We've essentially got repositories that hang off the organization. So in Azure DevOps, it is the project that sits under the organization. In GitHub, it is the repo that sits under the organization. So the structure is a little bit different, which is also why Microsoft has to build some migration tools to migrate from the one to the other. All right, and you'll see in there, I've essentially got, my repositories. And if I scroll down and I look at this slots repo, I'll use this slots repo quite a bit. I'm going to copy that for you as well and put it in the chat window. You might want to also, fork that repo. There's some instructions at the bottom here on how to achieve some of those deployment patterns I spoke about earlier on. But you will see that there's an option called projects, right? And if I go and add if I wanted to, create a new project, you'll notice that I've already got a project there, but I can actually say new project here. And the minute I say new project, it's going to allow me to specify either a board. I can give it a project name, project, and I can hit the create button. And this is a feature that we developed quite recently. It's only come out of sort of a, early sort of adopter quite recently. So it's available for everyone that's using it right now. But you'll see that this looks very similar to what I did earlier, right? Make a report for ... And you can see that, again, there's the make the report. I can drag this forward into in progress. I can drag this forward into done, and you'll see that I can even add some additional columns if I wanted to. So very similar to the Kanban boards that I had in Azure DevOps, except I can also, if I wanted to, I can also view this in a type of a table or a list, or I can view this information in a type of roadmap, which gives me a type of a calendar where I can manage some of these tasks and issues. Right, so we've got some project management capabilities inside of GitHub as well, but it is certainly not as extensive as the project and task related capabilities that we've got inside of Azure DevOps. All right, so that's essentially projects inside of GitHub, and you'll notice that I can essentially link my projects to multiple repositories, right? So if I go, for example, to my func repository, which is essentially just an Azure function or a set of Azure functions, and again, if you go looking, I've got lots of repos that you can actually clone on GitHub and test some capability. What I've done here is I've just started integrating into an Azure storage account to enumerate the blobs, list and create some table data, etc. in Azure storage accounts. But I'm slowly but surely also adding queries to the service bus, etc., etc. So there's a couple of options in here. But you'll notice if I click on projects here, then I can essentially link a project, and I can say, hey, I want to link the Friday project. And this will essentially allow me to, link the Friday project here. And this gives me some of that capabilities. So when I create, for example, a new issue, then it'll essentially allow me to link the two together, right? So I can go and add the projects in GitHub to the different repos that I've got. And that's essentially how I manage the projects across multiple repos and across multiple services and solutions that I might be building. It's not an easy thing to demo, but I hope that made sense. All right. I really hope all of this makes sense. I usually have a lot more slides that go into a lot more detail, so it feels like I'm rushing through some of these things. I'm going to probably, before we continue, suggest that we take a small break. if everyone's okay with that, maybe just take like a 15-minute break and then we'll continue after that. So maybe if you have questions, think of some questions. We can start with some questions in about 15 minutes and we'll be back directly after that and we'll continue. All right, let's get going. Alistair seems
Is
to
that
jogged around.
is that Microsoft elevator music? I just need
Absolutely.
To, there was
I
no
was
sort of.
waiting for you to take out your camera and take a picture of yourself in a mirror somewhere.
I no longer do those things. I do have a T-shirt that has sort of, nodded me on being the mirror selfie king, but I have yet to get back to performing those duties. I have my flock that will ask me to rate their mirror selfies. I lift mirror selfies. That does happen from time to time on Twitter, but no.
All right. I also have a flock that asks you to rate earache. Is that a thing? Not.
No, that never took off. That never took off.
Right. We're all on our own when it comes to earache, right?
If you
anyway,
blow your
I
nose
just,
so hard that you feel water come out of your eye, that does happen though.
How hard did she slap you?
Chris
All
Rock,
right.
Will Smith, right there.
Okay, well, let's not aim for any Oscars here. All right, so this is going to be the approach I'm going to be taking here. I want to work through Azure boards, then we'll look at Azure Devops repos. After that, we will look at Git repos, right? And after that, we will again sort of, we will come back to pipelines in Azure DevOps. We will look at actions in GitHub, and then we will look at artifacts in Azure DevOps and at packages inside of GitHub. And then after that, I'm going to just roll with a couple of pretty cool demos, I think. So let's get cracking here. So Azure DevOps also has repositories. Please, if there are questions, you're more than welcome to just unmute and ask. I'm not going to feel offended if you do that. So when it comes to Azure DevOps, we've got more than one repository, by the way, per project. So if I go, for example, for my repos here, you will see that there is a default My Friday repository that was created with this project that I created under my organization, right? My Friday. And you'll notice from there, I can essentially either create a new repository or I can even import a repository. So if I hit the import button, you'll notice that I can go and import either a Git or a Team Foundation version control repository of sorts. There's the commands that I would essentially use to clone this repository to my local device, or I can use Visual Studio Code for that. Or I can push an existing repository, from the command line by adding a Git remote for this. Or alternatively, again, I can sort of import the repository. Now, I'm not going to use this My Friday option at this point in time. I'm going to go back to my JM400 organization, because I've got a couple of projects in there that just kind of makes things a little bit easier to demo from my side. So you'll see that I've got, for example, I've got this AZ slots project, right? And in there, if I go for repos, you will see that currently AZ slots is empty. And what I can do is I can hit the import button, and I'm going to go for my, let's just go for my slots application here. And let's just import that repository from GitHub. Right, so there's this tool. I'm not sure if most of you might have heard about this. I will share the URL with you on the chat window as well, so that you've just got this. So there's this tool called the DevOps demo generator site, right? And from here, you'll notice that it essentially prompts me to select my organization. There's my Fridays and my JM400. But you'll notice that we've got a bunch of templates here. We've got Tailwind Traders, My Health Clinic, Ports Unlimited, which we use in a lot of our courses, right? But under DevOps Labs, you will see that there's some pretty cool ones, right? There's a Terraform, there's an Ansible, there's a Docker template, right? We've got an Azure Key Vault, there's a Kubernetes option, there's Selenium, Octopus, Sonar Cube. There's a whole bunch of different projects here that I can import into my organization, and it'll give you some source code. It'll give you some pre-baked pipelines with variables and all sorts of things. So you can kind of just tweak them and see how, what some of these things might look like. I mean, there's Microsoft Learn options in there. There's some Azure Community options. There's, some of the CAF options in there as well, if you want to, adhere to the cloud adoption framework, for example, et cetera, et cetera. So you can actually use this to import some of these templates into your Azure DevOps environment, and it'll essentially, give you some test and some scaffolding that you can actually start working with. Most of our labs, by the way, like this lab here, for example, will probably start by prompting you to create from that DevOps template environment. All right, so let's let me. There you can see it's imported my source code here now. So you'll see that there is there's, for example, some branches, right? And I can essentially go and add some files in here if I wanted to. I can create a fork if I wanted to. So a Git fork is essentially the ability for you to give every developer their own server-side copy of the repo, right? And I can work on that and eventually merge my changes back into the original repo if I wanted to do that. But you'll notice that it essentially allows me to work on my source code under my project, but you'll notice that I can also go and add some additional repositories. So you don't have to create multiple projects, as I mentioned earlier on, for individual solutions that you are working on. You can have one project with multiple repos, or you can have one project with a single repo, and you can assign sort of code ownership in subfolders in there if you wanted to do that, right? And I'll show you how to do that. One of the things that you want to do is you want to do what's known as branch protection, right? So as you are doing development, you don't just want any sort of developer to just willy-nilly, merge, their source code into your main branch. That might trigger a build, that might trigger a deployment, and eventually end up with something that's sketchy in your production environment, right? So you want to build in some protection, at least for your branches. And to this end, we've got this branches section on here in Azure DevOps, which is essentially going to show me my branches. And then you'll see on the right-hand side, there's an option there that says branch policies. And in the branch policies, I can actually go and secure some of these branches, right? So I might say that before someone merges into the main branch, there has to be at least 2 reviewers that are going to review this, right? So as you move your source code into the shared environment, whether it's DevOps or GitHub, you want to at least have some level of security and protection that allows people to rubber stamp and to authorize the changes into the environment, right? So to this end, you'll notice that I can specify X number of reviewers, allow requesters to approve their own changes. So can I approve my own changes? That might be a bit of a conflict of interest there, right? That kind of you might as well actually just switch this off if you're doing that, right? So be careful of allowing that, but in certain cases, it's probably viable. You will also see that I can actually specify that we are not going to merge any changes if we have not checked for linked work items. So I cannot merge my change into the Git repository if I don't specify what work item this is. This is really important from an overall project management perspective, because what you want to avoid is people working on things that are not planned, right? So we've all been there in a situation where you've got a project to deliver and someone from sales or wherever says to you, oh, just quickly do this. It's like, no, create a work item and then I'll work on it, right? And that's how it should be. So you can actually set up these policies and rules to specify, and then you can kind of push back to business saying, well, if there isn't a work item, I cannot merge my code. And if I cannot merge my code, then I cannot fix the problem, right? So you want these policies to kind of define those thresholds and rules so that you don't get shoved around by business going, oh, we need this now, we work on this, prioritize this, push it through the process, and we will work on it. And that's essentially what you want to use some of these things for. You can also check for things like a comment resolution. If you wanted to do that, you can do things like build validation, right? So I can specify we will only allow the change to be integrated if this build pipeline completes successfully, for example. And then we can also add some additional status checks. We can build out different statuses. So we can, for example, create a status of green, and under certain conditions, we can set the status to green, and then it will say, oh, well, we can merge this change because the status is green, right? So you can build out status checks. And then there's an option here that says automatically included reviewers. This is almost similar to the number of reviewers you'll see at the top here. The difference is if I require 2 reviewers, it could be anyone that reviews, right? So this is essentially maybe there's 10 developers working on this project. I make my changes. Any one of those 10 developers can approve the changes. If I scroll down to the bottom here, you will see that this is essentially where we can assign code ownership. So I can say that if the change is in this folder /src/ whatever, I don't even have a folder like that. But this is where I can go and assign code ownership to say, well, we've got 3 APIs that we are managing in this repository, and Johan is responsible for this API, Alistair is responsible for that API, and Nick is responsible for this API, just as an example, right? And I can actually go and split up my repository to say that these folks have got the different sort of ownership. And if it's a change in this area, let this person approve it, right? So again, quite granular control over who gets to approve certain things. And this capability, if you think about it, gives you a little bit more openness to say, well, we don't need a repository for each solution, right? We can have one repository, and we can segregate and break that repository up into different folders where there's different solutions in different folders, and I can still assign ownership at that level. So those are essentially branch policies. And I can essentially, implement these branch policies on my different branches where's branches. And this will essentially allow me to do that. For some of you that are new to DevOps, I'm not sure who is new to DevOps, a branch is essentially a copy of another branch that will allow me to make changes. And we tend to also have what's known as a branching strategy when we develop our DevOps processes. And it might be that you say, well, we're always going to have a master branch or a main branch or whatever you want to call it. And that's going to be the branch that is our kind of production branch, right? That's what we publish into our production application service, for example. But I can say that whenever we are working on a feature, we are going to create a branch for that feature. And you'll notice if I create a new branch here, I can say that this is, for example, the dev branch, and it's based on the master branch. And I can go and link it back to a work item to say, well, we're going to work on this branch, and we are working on this branch because we've got a product backlog item that says, create the new menu item, and we can actually call this the menu branch, right? I'm being facetious now, but I think you're getting the idea. So once I've made my changes in the menu branch, I can merge those changes into the master branch, and then those policies that I just showed you now in terms of securing the master branch will kick in, and someone will actually have to approve those changes before it gets merged into the master environment, into the master branch. So again, I hope that this makes 100%, Sean. Just work on this quickly, and your eye starts jumping like that squirrel from Ice Age. So yeah, well, I think we've all been there. It's not a good place to be. So once again, Azure DevOps, we've got repositories in there, and it can either be a Git repository, which is the distributed option, and we've got Team Foundation version control, which is a centralized option. If I can just quickly specify the differences between that. Ooh, wrong screen. So if we've got centralized source control versus distributed, sorry about my writing, and this is going to be something like Team Foundation version control, and this is going to be typically something like Git. There's many others as well, but what this essentially implies is with centralized, my developer is checking out code from a central environment, checking out individual files, locking them down. And if I've got another developer, they essentially have to connect to that environment and check out files as well, right? With distributed, we've essentially got a centralized repository, and I can clone the repository to my developer workstation, but this means another developer can essentially clone from that environment, right? So that's what we mean by distributed version control, and Git is essentially a distributed version control mechanism. I don't have to be connected to the centralized repository to get a copy of the code. And another key difference is with centralized version control, like Team Foundation version control, you essentially just take the current version of the code. With something like Git, you're essentially taking the entire repository with all the history, and you're working with that locally. So Git can become quite big in terms of cloning the repository down to my local machine. There's ways of doing that. There's ways to deflate the files in your Git repo. But anyway, so we've got that option inside of Azure DevOps. If I pivot this to GitHub, of course, GitHub only works with Git, right? There's no centralized version control, even though some might argue that the GitHub repository is the centralized repository, and it is, except with GitHub, I don't need the GitHub repo to clone another clone of the repo, right? So I can clone from GitHub, and then I can clone that repository somewhere else. I don't need GitHub to be able to get a copy of the repository, unlike with Team Foundation version control. GitHub repos is really where all the action is, right? And I'm going to quickly do a demo around some of this for you. So I've got this. I've got a bunch of repositories here. You will see that one of the repositories I've got is my slots repository. I use this in most of my training courses to show you different deployment patterns, to show you some app configuration. So if you want to know how to embed things like connection strings and things into your application, this app will essentially do it. It's just a .NET, I think it's a .NET 7 app at this point in time. Let me just check. Yeah, I've upgraded this now to .NET 7. But it's essentially just a vanilla MVC .NET application. Right, so you can see that I've got my source code, and you will see that at this point in time, I've only got one branch. So if I click on branches, again, I can go and create a new branch, very similar to what I did in Azure DevOps, except I'm doing it, of course, on GitHub now, right? So again, I can go and specify my branch, and I can say that this is the dev branch. I'm cloning this from the master branch, and if I hit the create branch, then there you can see I can be working on the dev branch. On top of that, if I go for my branches here, you will see that if I click on settings rather and click on branches, I can also add some branch protection rules, right? And this is very similar to the policies. This is very similar to the policies that we saw on branch level to protect our branches. You know, when someone makes changes and tries to merge those changes into the main branch, for example, you can see a very similar type of approach here, right? Require approvals, the number of people that I want to do approvals before that's changed. You know, require a review from code owners, right? GitHub has got a different way of doing this. GitHub has got a code owners file that will sit in a folder, and it points to a specific GitHub user, and that GitHub user will have to review the code before that merge is essentially, that change is merged into the main branch. So we've got a very similar type of approach here where there's, you know, the protection of the branch that gives you some hoops that you need to jump through before your change can get merged into the main branch. So this is something that is available for public repos, but you need to, I think, use GitHub Enterprise before you get this on private repositories. So I don't think you've got this option on private repositories. I can probably check quickly. Let me just quickly look at a private one. I don't think I've got this option here. So if I go for settings and branches, I think it's because I think it's because my account is linked up to the Microsoft corporate enterprise identity. So sorry, that demo didn't go the way I wanted to go. Anyway, you don't always get these branch protection policies. It's only under certain conditions, like a public template, enterprise accounts, essentially, where you get this branch protection on GitHub. It's not available all throughout the entire environment. But you will also see that there's a whole bunch of additional features here that allows me to protect my branch and to specify the exact conditions, you know, that needs to be in place before certain things, before I can merge. You can see that I can, for example, require, conversation resolution. So this is something else that we've got, is we've got discussions, and I can enable discussions around my settings. And you'll see if I go for general here, I think it's towards the bottom here. There you can see discussions. It's not enabled by default, but I can essentially enable discussions. And if there's a discussion around a specific feature, for example, and it's linked to different issues, then I might first want an issue resolved before I can actually merge the branch into the main branch, right? So there's various options for me to essentially protect my branches in here as well. So if I look at my GitHub repo, again, there's a couple of things. There's some settings, And these settings are very specific to the actual repo itself, right? So you will notice that I've got, for example, I've got the different collaborators, right? And I think I changed this damn password yesterday. So you can see that I can actually go and add some collaborators that will essentially you know, give access to the repository. Now this is a public template, but I can essentially invite collaborators, and these folks can essentially, you know, work on the project and work on the repository. You'll notice that we've got things like issues, for example. There's a couple of issues in here. I will get back to this a little bit later on. But you'll notice that I can actually go and create a new issue, and it can be a bug report, it can be a feature request, you know, report a security vulnerability, for example, and all of these will essentially feed back into my security information here, where I'll show you a bit later on. I've got some security, you know, reporting that I've enabled on this repo. Other than that, we've got some other basics. There's some insights. One of the things that I think is actually is worth mentioning is if you've got a GitHub account, you will see that under your repositories, if you have if you create a repository with the same name, with this name, sayedimac.github.io, then you'll notice that this is actually a URL that the GitHub folks will give to you, that you can essentially, you know, like a little static web application that you can actually go and you know, add some content. So all of the markdown files in here will essentially show here, and it gives you a unique URL with the name of your personal organization. In my case, that is sayedimac.github.io, and you know, all that static content can essentially show up here. This is essentially what we are doing with our lab instructions, right? We just create one of these per repo. All right, so there's a couple of things that that you can do around that. If I just go back to my my slots again, I'm not 100% sure if I want to get down to sort of major sort of details around this. We will talk about actions in a bit. I've just enabled discussions. It'll show me all the pull requests that I've got, right? If I click on closed, it'll show me all the previous pull requests that I've had as well. So if I go into my code here and I look at the master, I'm just going to, let's just update the README file. And let's just remove the there. That's obviously part of the demo. Then you'll see that I'm essentially, you know, I can commit this directly to the master branch. Now, this is something that will typically happen inside Visual Studio Code or inside your IDE. Doesn't necessarily happen inside here, but there's a great workflow. It's called the GitHub workflow that essentially allows me to create a new feature branch. As you can see there, sayedimac patch 1, propose the changes. From there, you will notice that it's essentially you know, specifying what these changes are. So if I go for pull requests here now, you'll notice that it says there, sayedimac patch has been had recent pushes less than a minute ago. I can click on compare the pull request. I can create a pull request at this point in time, and you can see that I can say, yes, I'm happy with this change. I can click on merge pull request. Ooh, I've got some dependency scanning that is happening, so I might give that a second. It might actually take a little bit longer than the demo. I want the demo to run, but I can click on merge the pull request, confirm the merge, and then, you know, based on my branching strategy, I either go and delete the branch, or I keep the branch going and then make further changes to the branch and merge those changes into the branch. I'm just going to end up deleting the branch here, and the branch is deleted. And if I go back to code now, then you will see that is gone at the bottom here, right? So again, I'm using the browser now, but most of this you will probably use from your IDE and whatever developer tool you are using, right? It's very nicely integrated into that as well. So I mentioned that. And if we go back here, one of the other things I just want to touch on quickly is Azure DevOps pipelines. Now we've got, this is kind of the meat and potatoes, if you like, of Azure DevOps, right? The automation part, the automated processes that you're going to be doing. So there's two ways of doing this inside of Azure DevOps. There's what's known as the classic editor, right, which is a graphical interface. And then there's a YAML editor, which is essentially a text-based pipeline. Now you'll notice in the slide here that I specify classic build and release, and I put in brackets there CI/CD, because in Azure DevOps, these are actually two areas that I will do my building, right? If I'm using YAML, I can still split it up into different YAML files and different pipelines if I wanted to, but very often the line between the CI and CD process gets a little bit blurred with YAML, because I can have one YAML file that does my build and the same YAML file or process rather that does my release, all in a single sort of one single go, right? So just be aware of that. Microsoft is trying to push everyone to use YAML. That's just the way it is right now. So we try our very best to move away from that classic editor. I'm going to demo that for you quickly. So there I've got my slots application. There's some pipelines. And this, by the way, is my build pipeline. Sorry about the writing here. And this is my release pipeline, right? So this is the CI and this is the CD pod. If I was using YAML, everything will sit under pipelines. There will be nothing under releases. I cannot have a YAML pipeline under releases. It's just the classic editor. So I'm going to go for pipelines here. You'll notice that I can say create a new pipeline. It's prompting me for where the code is, right? So you can see there that Azure DevOps actually has some integration into GitHub. It's got some integration into Bitbucket. There is Subversion, right? I can source my source code from either Azure DevOps itself, or I can get my source code from external sources if that's the way I want to roll. And this is an important point, because this means in Azure DevOps, you don't have to use the repositories in Azure DevOps to use the pipelines, right? If you just want to use Azure DevOps pipelines, you just use the pipelines and store your code somewhere else. So it's very flexible to that end. And you'll notice that, again, it gives me a couple of options here for, where's the source code. All of these are YAML pipelines. And just hidden at the bottom there's the option that says use the classic editor. I'm going to use that just for now, just to kind of show you what these look like, and then I'll come back to the YAML pipeline. So I'm going to use the classic editor. It's prompting me, hey, where's what is your source code? And again, I can point it to other services, Bitbucket Cloud, GitHub, etc. And I can go for, AZ slots here, just as an example. This is the AZ slots repo, but I'm going to point it to slots. There we go. There's a repository called slots. And you can see that I pointed to the default branch there, right? It's not the right one. I'm just being an idiot. So there's the branch, and I can hit the continue button. And from here, it's prompting me to say, well, what exactly do you want to be doing here, right? Is this going to be a ASP.NET application? What do we need to build this with, right? So if I was, for example, building a container application, then in here, I will typically search for something like Docker, right? And we'll see that there's the components to build the Docker, container images. If I was using something like Helm, right? There's the Kubernetes service, so I can use something like Helm to package my container images. If I was using something like Maven, right? There you can see there's Maven for Java applications, right? If I was building a Node application, then you'll see that there's, for example, Node.js with Grunt and Gulp, a bunch of services that essentially allow me to build Node applications, right? So nothing is stopping me from using any one of those. I'm just going to go with the ASP.NET Core, and you'll see that there's a restore, there's a build, there's a test option, and then there's a publish option. And then after that, it will publish some sort of an artifact. The artifact in this instance will essentially be the binary that I can deploy to a server, right? So that is what this build pipeline is all about. Now you'll notice that I've got some pipeline variables that I can use, right? I might want to use that for naming during my pipeline. There's a bunch of triggers. I can say enable continuous integration so that when there's a change on the branch, it kicks this off automatically. If I don't enable continuous integration, this workflow and pipeline will not automatically get triggered when there's a change on the repository, right? So this is kind of how I tie up my pipeline with changes on my repository itself. There's also an option there that says batch changes while the build is in process. And what this essentially means is if I'm busy with a build right now and there's 5 additional changes on my repo, don't trigger 5 additional builds. Wait until this build is finished and then start a build with the latest changes, right? So you don't have essentially 5 builds and actually you're waiting for the last one to complete. So I can enable that continuous integration. I can do this build on a schedule. This is something that developer teams like to see, right? We all know this afternoon at 5 o'clock, we're going to trigger a build. Make sure your code is in by that time. If your code is in, don't break the build. So do your testing before you merge your changes so that we can be sure that you don't break the build. And this is maybe part of your process, right? So as you finish up for the day, or maybe you do this at lunchtime so you can still have time to fix the problem, you can go and say, well, you know, you broke the build. And I know of some teams that even have little lights above the developer workstation. Red light means I broke the build, right? So you can do this on a schedule, but I can even trigger this when another build is completed. And then there's some options here. You will see towards the bottom there, there's your build status badges. If I want to put this somewhere on a web page, for example, and there it shows me my history. I'm gonna specify the agent here. I'll talk about the agent in a minute. I'm just gonna go with Ubuntu, and I'm gonna hit the save and queue option. And this should actually build this application of mine. So there you can see I've triggered the job. And what's happening now is this job is waiting for an agent. And I built a slide around this. So give me a second. So I just pull up this slide quickly. All right. So your continuous integration, continuous delivery pipelines, right? On the Azure Devops side, we've got either Microsoft hosted, which is what I just used right now. I did not create a virtual machine, put the agent on there and use that agent. I used the Microsoft hosted agents. So you either use Microsoft hosted agents or you use your self-hosted agents. The Microsoft hosted agents has got some time limits on how long the jobs can run. So on private repositories, your job has to complete in 60 minutes. On public repositories, your job has to finish within 360 minutes, all right? If your jobs run longer than that, your only option is to create a virtual machine, for example, and let the virtual machine host the agent and let the agent essentially then run over that time limit. So the minute you use a self-hosted agent, you might actually you will be able to let the job run as long as you want, really, right? There's no limit on self-hosted jobs. Why would you want, in addition to that, why would you want self-hosted agents? Well, as long as your agent has got line of sight with the DevOps services, and there are some IP addresses that you can essentially, that's published, that you can say these are the IP addresses we need to be able to communicate with, so you can hit those into your firewall. It might also be that your build process needs to access some sort of a service that you got running on-prem, or a database, for example, or there's some source code somewhere that is not publicly accessible. So in those instances, you might need self-hosted agents to get access to those services on-prem or wherever that might be. As long as your self-hosted agent has got line of sight with Azure DevOps and those IP addresses, then it's essentially going to be polling Azure DevOps on an ongoing basis. So we don't push a message down to the pipeline agent. The pipeline agent polls the Azure service to say, is there a job? Is there a job? It's essentially a long HTTP poll, and it says, is there a job? Yes, there's a job. Pull down everything required for the job and execute the job. We can also group these agents together. So it means that I can have one virtual machine that runs multiple agents, right? And those agents can be part of multiple groups. So, you got some flexibility in there. Let's just see how far this thing is. Happy days. It looks like it's actually completed that job. It's churned out this artifact. And if I wanted to release this to an application, then you will see I can click on my release pipeline, and I can actually go and deploy this to Azure App Service, for example, right? Hit the apply button. I can call this the deploy stage. And you'll see if I click on the job, it's prompting me here for an Azure subscription. And I can specify some sort of an app service. I don't have an app service there. Let's see, I should have one. Interesting. That's wrong. Let's check. I'm sure I had an app service in here somewhere. No, I don't. It's only a function app. So I'm going to quickly create one, and I'm going to call this one the Friday app. Let's go for code. The runtime stack is going to be .NET 7. It's going to be Windows based. Create the plan, and I'm going to go with UK South here. Next, monitor, review and create. So I'm just creating a Azure App Service quickly. This will just take a few seconds. Gosh, that's probably the commentator's curse. I should stop saying it's going to take a few seconds, because then the Azure portal hears that and it goes, I'll show this guy something. And it takes 7 weeks to create an app service. Oh, come on, man. My. There we go. So this app service is in my always on subscription and a resource group called Friday App Group. This usually takes about 20 seconds. And if you remember, when we spoke about those deployment patterns, I said that app services essentially, allow me to embrace some of those deployment patterns we spoke about. There we go. Happy days. It's up and running. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go for my deployment center. Well, there's my deployment slots rather. I'm going to add a new slot and I'm going to call this one let's call it UAT. Well, before I do that, let me just add some configuration first. I'm going to add a new application setting here. I'm going to say dbcon, and I'm going to say that this is the database connection string from production. And I'm going to add a new application setting called color. And I'm going to say this is going to be white. And I will add another one called site. And I'm going to say that this is the production site. And I'll add a last one that says auth. This one I'm not making a deployment slot setting. And I'll hit the save button. So these configuration values on my app service are essentially config settings that will eventually manifest as environmental variables for my application. So if I go to my deployment slots here and I say add a new slot, let's make this a UAT slot, and I can say clone the settings from the Friday production app and hit the add button. What's essentially going to happen is the Azure Resource Manager is going to create another app service called Friday app-UAT. It'll have its own URL, right? It's essentially its own service, right? And I can now from my pipeline publish my application into the UAT environment, and when I'm ready, I can swap that out with production in a blue-green type deployment pattern. If I wanted to do something like A/B testing here, you'll notice that I can say route 50% of the request to the UAT application, route 50% of the request to production, right? And I can slowly start incrementing that to say we are taking this into production slowly but surely, and we can change those values. But there you can see there's my Friday application. And if I go for the URL there, you can see there's the vanilla Azure app service up and running there, right? So what I'm planning to do here now is I'm planning to hit the refresh button. Select Windows. Let me just make sure it's in the right subscription. Yeah, it is in the right one. Just hang on for a sec. I'm just going to authorize that. It'll just take a second. It's essentially creating a security principle now inside of Azure that's giving this this DevOps project the permissions to go and access that subscription. All right. And then there's my Friday application. And if I click on Azure Devops services here, you will see that I can essentially deploy it to a slot or app service environment. And if I specify a resource group, there's my Friday resource group, and there's the slot. And I can actually go and specify I'm going to publish this into UAT. So the first thing I want to do here is I want to just change the configuration quickly. Give me a sec. There's someone at the door here. All right. So I'm going to change the color here to lemon chiffon, which is actually a color. The database connection is going to be the UAT database connection, and the site is going to be UAT. And I'll hit the save button. I'm making these changes now at the UAT site level. So the minute I actually release here, I'm expecting those values to show up in the application. So there we go. I'm going to hit the save button. And then I'm essentially just going to create a new release. So this is essentially my my continuous delivery pipeline that is essentially taking the artifact that was generated, from my build pipeline, and it's essentially publishing that into my production environment, into my UAT environment. And when I'm ready, I can actually go and add another stage here. You can see that specify app service. Should be able to do this. There should be an option here to actually swap it. I'm not going to do that now, so don't worry about that. But anyway, if I wanted to, I can actually in my pipeline swap out the UAT environment with production. So let's quickly take a look at these releases. Here's that release. Oh, it's failed. I know what went wrong there. Just edit this. I need to add an artifact, and I'm going to add that artifact there. Add and save, and then I'm just going to create a new release. I didn't actually link it to my artifact that was generated from the build, so it ran the pipeline, but it didn't have anything to deploy. So that's what went wrong there. So there's my release. It's busy queuing right now. If I go for logs here, you will see it's found the agent now, and it's initializing the job. So it's going to take the artifact that was built in the process, and it's going to take that artifact and deploy it into that app service. I'm running a little bit low on time here, so I want to get cracking. This should not take too much longer, actually. It's downloading the artifact now to the agent. Now the agent is essentially authenticating into Azure, taking this artifact, this binary that was created, right? And if this was something like a container image, it'll contact the container registry, pull the image, and push that into the app service if I was running a containerized application. You'll notice it's contacting the application, Kudu application settings. This is not the animal that's wandering around Africa. African kudus don't have GitHub or Git endpoints. It's doing a zip deploy here. Just wait a few seconds. There we go, done and dusted. So if I go to my UAT environment here and hit the refresh button, there's my application running now. You'll notice that it's got the UAT site there. But of course, as you might imagine, my production application My production application is still showing the original sort of template that the Azure portal deployed, right? So now I can actually go and hammer this UAT environment. You can see that it's getting the connection string from UAT. It's the lemon chiffon color that I used, etc., etc. When my UAT testers are done with this now, I can actually go into my deployment center, into my deployment slots here, and I can actually go and swap this out now. So I can take this into production. It also gives me a 0 downtime deployment, right? Because the application is already warmed up. What actually happens here is there's a load balancer in front of this application service. So if I perform a swap with preview, then you'll see what is actually going to be changing. The current value is going to change from lemon chiffon to white. The database connection from UAT is going to change to the database connection from production, and the site name is going to change from UAT to prod. I can start the swap, complete the swap in a few seconds. And of course, as I mentioned, this is something that I can also do with from my pipeline if I wanted to do that. I also mentioned in the pipeline, I also mentioned that we want to protect the pipeline. So there you can see in the pipeline itself, you can see that I can go and specify some pre-deployment approvals, right? I can say this is only going to happen if Johan Meiberg has actually approved this, right? And he's got 30 days to do that. I've also got some gates here, right? And you'll notice that in the gates, I can say, well, check with Azure policy compliance. There's the query work item. So I can say this deployment is only going to happen if there are 0 bugs on the project, for example, in those queries that I spoke about earlier on. This is how I will tie those things in here as well. I can also query Azure to Azure monitor alerts. I can invoke a REST API. I can invoke an Azure function, check with Sonar Cloud, quality of my code, etc., and do a whole bunch of different things. So if I click on complete swap here, what the app service is going to do is the load balancer is going to drain out the request on production, drain out the request on the UAT environment, and then it'll start routing the UAT request to production and the production requests to UAT. So within a few seconds, if the demo goes according to plan, then my production environment should show the application and all the production settings should be in production, and my old UAT environment should show the old production environment. And again, this is something that you probably want to do from your pipeline so that it's part of your process, not wait for someone to actually do things manually. So this is my old UAT environment. I hit the refresh. There's the old production. This is my old production environment. I hit the refresh. This is now my production environment. Welcome to the production site. There's the database connection string, the white color, etc., etc. So it's actually worked quite nicely. And this is the slots application that I shared on the chat earlier on. So you don't have to write any code to get that going. Just create those values. I've got all the instructions at the bottom here to get that working. It's a very simple starting point to work with application services and application slots. All right, so that's that. The last thing I do want to show you quickly is if I go for pipelines, and let me just go look at my pipelines here. I think this is actually a YAML option. Here we go. So this is essentially the YAML pipeline, right? It's not the classic editor. We prefer for you to be using this. We're moving to this in quite a big way. GitHub Actions also uses YAML to this end, so it's something that you wanna kind of skill yourself up on. You don't have to learn. All essentially you need to learn is the YAML syntax, right? For example, if I wanted to publish, publish a .NET Core application, we will essentially, give you the code in the editor here. You don't have to go and edit this code. All you have to do is you have to understand the indentation and spaces in YAML, and that's really that, right? It's going to be a copy and paste operation, as most development is nowadays. So there you can see a very similar type scenario. It's doing a build, and eventually, if I search for app service, for example, there you can see Azure App Service deploy. I can specify my subscription. I can I thought I already authorized that, but it is what it is. App service name, there's my Friday app, deployed to a slot service. I'm not actually going to do it here now. It's bleeding a bit here. It's not finding the UAT slot there. It is what it is. I'm just going to hit the add button here. And there you can see there's essentially the YAML code for deploying, this application, very similar to what I had in that graphical interface a couple of minutes ago. I'm doing everything from YAML. So you might argue that YAML kind of grays the lines between CI and CD a little bit, because you might have everything in a single pipeline, right? Your build part, some of your testing, and then your eventual deployment as well. But that's just the way the industry is moving at this point in time. It's basically mostly YAML type scenarios. All right, so that was a very quick sort of waffle through the Azure DevOps pipelines. Let's take a quick look at GitHub, right? So GitHub has got a very similar type of approach, except in GitHub we call them runners. We don't call them agents. So you've got a GitHub runner, and a runner is essentially the agent that is going to be doing the work, right? Your job in GitHub has to be 6 hours or 35 days, right? For the entire workflow. If you are self-hosting the runner, you can also use self-hosted runners for GitHub. It doesn't just have to be GitHub hosted, but it's YAML only, right? On GitHub, there's only the YAML option. Now, I've got a nice demo here. On GitHub. Let me just find it. So I've got this GitHub actions. You'll notice that there I can actually, so pivoting now to the GitHub side, I want to show you how I'll do that CI/CD component from here. And you'll notice if I click on new workflow here, you'll notice that it prompts me, right? What do you want to do? Is this a .NET application? Deploy a .NET Core app to an Azure App Service, and what exactly do you want to be doing, right? So got all these options. You'll notice that we can deploy to Amazon. We can deploy, Terraform, use Terraform to deploy infrastructure as code, deploy to Alibaba Cloud. Given that GitHub Actions doesn't have all the endpoints that Azure DevOps has, Azure DevOps can even deploy to the Apple and the Google Play Store for that matter. So good mobile integration. We don't have that level of integration with GitHub Actions yet, but we certainly will get there. There you can see a .NET application, for example, and I can actually go and build this myself if I wanted to, and not use one of those templates and say, well, this is going to be a .NET application, right? Or whatever I want to be doing there. Essentially, your GitHub Actions or workflows are essentially just inside the GitHub folder. There's a workflows folder, and inside of that, there is going to be a YAML file, right? If I click on the main YAML file here, you will see that this main YAML file is doing two things. This is an Azure function, by the way. So it's doing two things here. The first thing is it's got a name of the name of the GitHub action, well, the GitHub workflow really, and then you'll see the criteria for when I want this to be triggered, right? At this point in time, any push on the main branch is going to trigger it, and I've specified that I wanted to ignore this pipeline if I'm making changes to the readme.master.markdown file, right? So you can specify exactly what criteria, even on a cron schedule, when you want to, want this pipeline to run on GitHub Actions. There's also a manual option, and I can trigger it manually if I've specified workflow dispatch. So if I go for GitHub Actions here and I click on my build and deploy .NET Core application, you will see on the right-hand side there's a run workflow option that is only showing because I've got that workflow dispatch option in there. And then there's some environmental variables, and then there's the individual jobs, right? You can see there, build and push image. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually creating a container image from this application. The Docker file is in there. You can just use it if you want to. And then after that, I'm pushing this to the GitHub container registry. I'm not sure if you even knew that there was a thing. But I can push it to any container registry. It's all sort of standards based. And then after that, I'm publishing this to an Azure function app inside my Azure service, right? So doing a couple of things in here. So GitHub Actions, of course, as I mentioned, is only YAML based, right? And you will see that there's lots of capability inside GitHub that is essentially using GitHub Actions for certain things. So if I, for example, create a new flow here and I scroll right to the bottom, you will see that there's things like labeler, right, which is going to essentially automatically label some of my items automatically using a workflow. So there's lots of actions inside our GitHub Actions, and you can use them for all sorts of things: builds, labeling, deployments, etc. And it's essentially all YAML based. Right, I'm not going to get into too much details. After this, I will share some links with you on the chat where you can get some additional information around some of these. Right, GitHub Actions, pretty good feature. And you will notice that if I look at, for example, one of these, then you'll see it looks very similar to what I showed you earlier on with Azure Devops. It's essentially developed by the same developers, right? So you'll see it looks very similar. It gives you a very sort of fuzzy feeling that this is actually more or less the same sort of thing that's happening in the background. All right, and I can rerun some of the jobs, etc. All right, I want to get to some other demos. The last thing I wanted to chat about is packages and Azure DevOps artifacts. So we all know that applications are not necessarily developed by a single team nowadays. So to this end, you're mostly using packages that is essentially code that's written by other teams. Now, if you're on the .NET stack, you're probably using NuGet. If you're, you're using NPM, probably if you're using something like Node.js, Maven on Java, for example. But the reality is, if I'm integrating with the Azure storage accounts, for example, Azure storage accounts will have a GitHub, will have a NuGet package that I can import into my application, and it brings that code into my application and allows me to leverage what the other developers have done. So to this end, I can store artifacts like this, Maven packages, NuGet packages, NPM packages in both Azure DevOps as well as in GitHub. Let me show you this quickly. So I'm going to go with packages here. Just give me a second. I've got one here. There we go. There's packages. I've got this. I've got artifacts in here, and you'll see that I've got a parts unlimited package. This is just a little bit of source code that I've published, and you'll notice that if I click on on this, then there's an option that says connect to the feed. If I was using something like .NET, then these are the commands that I will use. This is what I'll embed in my application. If I was using NuGet exe, if this was an NPM package, that is essentially the commands. If this was Maven, this is what I'll do in my project to reference this package. But you will see that I can version it essentially, and if I look at the current version, you'll notice that I can essentially promote it as well. So as you build your applications, you might use your pipeline to do the build and then to package your binary somehow and then publish it into Azure Artifacts, right? And this is true for any of these. So if I create a new feed here, I can say this is the Friday feed, just as an example. I can include upstream sources as well, and I can hit the create button, and you'll see that there's my Friday feed now. I haven't got anything in there right now. I'm not going to publish anything either. But if I click on connect to feed, then you'll see that there's, the .NET commands that I would execute. .NET restore, or, if I was using something like NuGet, then I will essentially add this into my, my NuGet config. For .NET, I will add this into my project, right? So Azure DevOps has got artifacts that will essentially allow me to, to store and manage my packages, restore the packages, and roll my packages through the feed, so that as we make changes, those packages, are available for my consumers of my application to use. We've got a very similar thing actually on GitHub. I'm running a little bit low on time here. So what I've got is GitHub packages. And by the way, if I delete this, let me just delete this my func quickly. I'm just doing that so it shows you can also use GitHub packages for storing Maven, NuGet, Ruby gems, NPM, but also Docker and other containerized applications, right? So this is something that not a lot of people are actually aware of inside GitHub, but I don't have to use either public feeds or private feeds inside of Azure DevOps. I can use GitHub for this as well, right? And you'll notice that if I go to my function here, and I trigger this function, it's essentially going to run this workflow. And this will essentially use a GitHub action to build this function application as a container image and publish the container image into the GitHub container registry. I can do this from the command line as well if I wanted to. So if I go for documents, content, repos, where's my slots? Let me just crack this open quickly with Visual Studio Code. Then you'll notice, let me just crack open this guy quickly. So there's an option, and you'll notice that what I'm using here is GitHub container registry.io. So I've got, hey, I don't think I've got Docker running currently. Let me just quickly boot it up. So I've got Docker running locally. So what I can do is I can essentially, take my, this is again, that slots application that I put on the chat window early on. I can essentially build this, this Docker image. and then I can essentially publish it, right? Push it to GitHub container registry.io / Sayedi Mac / slots. This will just take a few seconds. And if I go into my packages here, then you'll see that slots is essentially in there, and you can see that I can use just a plain Docker pool and that image. So whether you are storing Maven packages, whether you are storing container images, you can use both Azure DevOps, and you can also use GitHub for that. All right, I've got a couple of additional demos. I just want to quickly go through. I'm not going to take much more of your time. So the one thing that you might have heard of, and let me just quickly pull this up here. I underestimated my time that I've got, is right, where are we now? All right, code spaces. So some of you might have heard of code spaces. Code spaces is essentially a mechanism that we are building to run your application development environment in the cloud. So you'll notice if I go for my repo here, let's say for example slots, I think I've got a code space there. Then you'll notice that I've got a code space called stunning yodel. And if I make this full screen here, you should see, and we're talking predominantly here about GitHub, right? We don't have this capability on Azure DevOps, so some of these features are GitHub related, and you'll also see that this is essentially where Microsoft is putting in a lot of our efforts and our resources is going into GitHub right now. But there you can see, I put this in full screen, and you probably won't even notice that I'm running this in the browser, right? In fact, I don't think this is actually going to work, but if I run this, it will actually build the application, spin up, the actual service, and open up some ports for me to access this application from this environment. It's essentially a containerized application. It's bleeding. It's not going to work now. I know it's going to break. Anyway, there you can see if I had this configured correctly, it'll essentially allow me to run the application in my code space as well. So what is code spaces? Code spaces is a cloud-based development environment that allows you to offset your development workspace into the cloud so that you don't need, lots of iron on your local laptop, for example, right? It's running in the cloud. You don't need something installed locally. Think of all the compliance issues that you can work your way around, right? So if I've got my source code locally on my device, that's a major risk, really, if your developers have got access to everything locally, right? What happens if that laptop gets lost? So with code spaces, we can essentially take our development environment, and let me just go back here and I'll show you. I'll show you another one quickly. Not sure why it's not showing this to me now. There you can see new code space, and you can see that I can specify the repository, maybe the function application, and I can go and specify the number of cores that I want to use. So we will then create a container instance of Visual Studio Code that's hosted in the cloud that you can connect to. You can use it on a browser. I actually use this on a little iPad, right, for that matter, if I wanted to just play around with something. So code spaces is that ability for you to take your development environment, store it in the cloud, and I can even synchronize that with a local sort of, on-prem type scenario. In fact, you can see here that I can actually, I think it's in here that I can essentially open in Visual Studio Code desktop. So that will essentially connect to the containerized application from Visual Studio Code, but the repository is never stored locally on my device. I've actually got some another scenario for this as well that I just want to demonstrate quickly. There we go. So I've got this a repository called Kubernetes and Code Spaces, and you'll notice that if I go for Code Spaces here, then it's essentially going to give me a code space for that. And just to prove to you that you can almost do anything you want in these code spaces, this is essentially a GitHub code space that's running Kubernetes, and I will actually have a fully functional, fully built Kubernetes cluster that runs in this containerized instance of mine using those CPUs and things that I specified. And if I go in here and look at my ports, for example, within a few seconds, all the applications that I've got going, there's, for example, there's WebV, there's Prometheus, right? And all of these things are essentially running locally. And it'll just take a few seconds to come through. So you can do in this code spaces exactly what you want to do in there. And there's, for example, Grafana, right? I've got Grafana running there as well. So it might just take a few seconds to catch a bit of a wake up, and then it'll be available there. Oh, come on, man. It's taking its sweet time here, it seems. I don't have time to spend on this now. All right, and then there's one last thing that I wanted to just also chat through. So we've also got some enhanced security components inside of GitHub, right? That allows you to do some code scanning, for example, right? All of this can be automated from GitHub as well. We've got some integration with third-party tools inside of Azure Devops as well. But with CodeQL, you can basically scan some of your code and even query some of your code. And on top of that, we can actually check to see if some of the developers have accidentally added passwords or secrets or other connection strings, for example, in the source code, right? And it'll essentially scan for some of those options. I've got some examples around that. I'm actually not going to demo that. I'm running too low on time here. The last thing I want to demo is this. I'm going to, there's probably one of the latest features that we've got is this thing called GitHub Copilot. So I'm just going to do a last demo on Copilot, and then I'm going to be done. I'm sorry I'm going through these things so quickly. I underestimated my time here. So I'm going to create a new folder called Fridays. And I just want to give you a sort of taste as to, what this is all about. So I've got GitHub Copilot installed on here and running here, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a .NET new console application. This is essentially going to create a new console app for me, and you'll see that there's, my program, console.write, hello world, blah, blah, blah. All right, so check this out. What I'm going to do here is I want to create a class of an employee. See that autocomplete that it's doing for me there? This is GitHub Copilot thumb-sucking what it wants me to code, right? It's going like he's wanting to create a new class of employee. What are the typical fields that you might want for an employee? Name, department, salary, just as an example. If I say animal, right? it's gonna come back. It's gonna come back within a few seconds, and oh, come on. Maybe I should have just gone with the employee when I had it. Public. Employee, here we go. I'm just going to stick with that, right? So you can see there now that I can, it's generating all this code for me. I did a test about a week ago, and I ended up building like a fully fledged little application, and I wrote about 15% of the code. The rest was actually spat out by this, Copilot. So you can see there, I can specify, employee E, and it'll go, well, you're probably wanting to create a new employee. There's the name, John, age, department, IT. It's just auto-completing all of this for me, right? So GitHub is not just GitHub the way we knew GitHub in the past, right? And you can see there that I can actually go write this out. We're doing a huge amount of things inside of GitHub to make your development time a lot less, to assist you with your build pipelines. So use some of these features. There are some great features, and let me know if you have any questions around this. I'm more than happy to field some questions if you have some questions afterwards. Some of these features have already shipped. Blackbird, this is essentially already integrated into our search now, so you can search code down to sort of, test it out. You can see cs.github.com, or you just go to github.com/search. We've got a GitHub Enterprise importer that will allow you to import, even ADO components into GitHub. There's a Valet service that will essentially allow you to migrate workflows from ADO, from Jenkins, from GitLab, etc., into GitHub Actions. And then, if you're not familiar with this, we've also got a GitHub CLI, a desktop, and even a mobile application that will that we've got available for you to approve pull requests if you're doing that while you're busy Brian. And that, ladies and gents, is the full time I've got. I apologize for going a little bit over time, but if there are questions, I'll gladly take some questions. I hope that was valuable for you. I've kind of run out of time here, so yeah, apologies for that. I hope that made sense. It was a lot of information. All right. Security scanning. Would you recommend it being included as the deployment gate or within the GitHub workflow build file? I will typically do that. I would typically do that as part of my build in the GitHub Actions. It depends. It depends what type of service you are using, right? I know, for example, that things like White Source Bolt, or it's called Mend now, right? There's GitHub Actions for some of those things. So it just depends what type of scanning you want to be doing and what the vendor is that you are using. Some of them have got some actions. Some of them you might have to integrate, at a later point in time. So it really just depends on the type of security scanning that you want to be doing. Oh, it feels like I've rushed through this quite a lot, ladies and gents, but I hope that made sense. I didn't confuse the crap out of you, which is also possible. I feel like I rushed through that.
We like the sound of your voice, Johan. It's the most important part.
My mother also used to say that. So I'm never sure if someone says it, if they actually mean it.
If they're not your
I've got to jump.
They probably mean it. Yeah, thanks, Johan.
I've got to drop. I'm going to hand over to Matt. Johan, as always, I'll ping you later. Your mic sounds good. I've got to jump on another call now. And I'm handing back to Matt. Johan, I'll ping you on WhatsApp.
Yeah,
people.
Cool,
Happy Friday. Bye.
Yes, man.
Yeah. Thanks, Al. Thanks, Johan. Yeah, that was awesome. I had to jump to another meeting, but of what I saw, it was a nice little comparison between or actually quite an in-depth comparison between ADO and GitHub. So yeah, for me that was useful. I still don't know which one like I would choose. Personally, I like ADO, Azure Devops, but then, you know, if your organization is not using DevOps currently and they're using GitHub or other Git type of services, maybe they're going to stick with that. I don't know.
So I get asked that quite a lot, right? So what do we use? And the answer is, if you're currently invested in ADO, continue to use ADO. We're not going to pull the plug on that. Thanks, Godfrey. We're not going to pull the plug on that anytime soon. We're also using that internally. But if you're new to DevOps, probably I would recommend you go the GitHub route. But you know, it also, I would also say, it also depends on what you are where you're trying to deploy it to, right? GitHub Actions can deploy to lots of services, but in ADO we've got major integration into third-party vendors. You know, as I mentioned, the Apple Store, the Google Play Store. We don't have that on GitHub Actions yet, right? So our target deployment environments from GitHub Actions is lagging a bit behind in ADO. So, you know, it just depends what you're trying to achieve. But if I had to work with a new customer today that is new on this journey, then I would point them towards GitHub for sure. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm sure. Well, we've got some other people on the call, like Neil. Maybe other people have got their own opinions.
Absolutely.
To hear what people say.
Yeah, let's hear.
Anybody come off mute? I think we can go for a couple of minutes and then we'll close off the call.
Yeah, 100%.
Oh. Yes, Neil does have his own opinions. But he's getting
so you should
himself. Thanks, Neil. Right. Okay, well, yeah, thanks, Johan. Again, that we really appreciate your time, and it was great content that you shared with us.
Only a pleasure.
We are recording the session, so we'll hopefully upload this to YouTube so people can consume it later. That's what Cloud Fridays is all about. You know, the learning and sharing the learnings of other people. And so if you didn't get everything today, this morning, come back to YouTube and catch it. I was actually just trying to find the YouTube channel to make sure that I can share that in the link. So give me a sec. I've got the YouTube channel. I will post in the chat so that you can check out previous videos that we've done and also view the video from today once it's uploaded. If you subscribe, you'll get a notification. Cool. Yeah, so thanks everyone. Thanks for joining. This was cool. And thanks, Johan, for your time.
It's a pleasure, man.
Chat again
thanks.
soon.
I'll chat with you guys again soon. Thanks, Matt. Have a great afternoon. Ciao, ciao.
Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.